This is James Lupton for Pro Boxing Fans. Delighted to be joined on Zoom today with Todd Snyder, author of Bundini, Believe the Hype. Todd, how are you?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No worries at all. Before we move on to the book, let's just start with yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you're such a boxing fan.
Well, I grew up around boxing my entire life. My father was a boxing trainer, and I grew up in a small town in West Virginia. And he had a series of, I'll call them makeshift boxing clubs, the lower levels of boxing, but he trained amateurs and a couple professionals. So my father was a boxing trainer, so I grew up in the gym as a kid. He didn't let me box until I was 16 years old. So I boxed during my high school years. And then when I went off to college, I hung up the gloves and started helping him work with fighters in the gym. And I would come home from college on summer breaks and work corners with him, mostly at the amateur level. And, boxing was sort of, the background of my childhood. I grew up hearing speed bags and heavy bags and, jump ropes hitting a hardwood floor. That was sort of the soundtrack to my childhood. And my dad's hero was Muhammad Ali. I mean, Muhammad Ali was the guy he loved as a kid. My dad came up in the 70s where, Ali was the man. So, Ali was always Ali posters in the gym, Ali posters in our home. And Bundini was sort of someone who was in the shadows of Muhammad Ali's mystique. And I grew up a huge hip hop fan. And I always loved Bundini as a street poet. I loved when he and Ali would do those routines before the fight. So, the first book I ever read cover to cover was Ali's biography, The Greatest. And I was always fascinated by Bundini. So when I got the opportunity to write a book about him, I didn't pass it up. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity.
You say there that was the first book you read and you was fascinated by him. What age were you at this point?
Yeah, I was in the 7th grade, and it was the first book I ever tried to read cover to cover. I was a kid who grew up playing sports. I really wasn't into reading or writing, and it was boxing and hip hop that got me into reading and eventually wanting to become a writer. Because hip hop made poetry cool. It made language cool. It made metaphor and simile interesting to me. And of course, I was so obsessed with Ali and boxing history that reading those boxing books, even for a working class kid like me, seemed like a cool thing to do. So it was sort of my gateway into literacy was boxing and hip hop. And I think Bundini had a foot in both worlds. He was sort of hip hop before there was such a thing. And Ali, most hip hop history books credit him as being a pre-hip hop icon. So that it was sort of those impulses that brought me to want to read about Bundini and eventually write his story.
So how did the opportunity arise? Obviously, this is a guy that you've sort of looked up to and you've followed for much of your life, and all of a sudden you get the opportunity to write a book about him. Was it something that was presented to you? Was it an idea you had that you pitched to the publishers?
It was a little bit of both. I teach courses at a college here in New York. It's Siena College. And one of the courses I teach in the spring semester is history of hip hop culture. And we watched the documentary Ali Rap. And if you haven't seen it, it was produced by ESPN, and Chuck D of Public Enemy is the narrator to the documentary. And essentially what the documentary is a bunch of hip hop artists talking about how Ali influenced the culture. And you have rappers like Nas, reciting Ali's famous lines, that kind of thing. So I show that in my class every year, sort of explaining partially how hip hop came to be, because it wasn't born in a vacuum. A lot of factors sort of led to hip hop becoming popular in the United States, and Ali was sort of pre-hip hop. So I show that documentary every year, and Chuck D is the narrator. Where one year Chuck D was able to come to our college and give a guest lecture, and my students were given the opportunity to have dinner with him. And we were sitting around the table, and one of my students asked Chuck D, was Ali the first rapper? And if he is float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, your hands can't hit what your eyes can't see, the first rap lyric. And Chuck laughed at that and said, you might be right. And I chimed in and said, well, if Ali's the first rapper, then Bundini must be the first hype man. Because, he was the one who coined that phrase. And Chuck laughed and he said, someone should write a book on Bundini. And that always stuck with me. So I had the idea in the back of my head from Chuck D at Public Enemy that, Bundini hadn't really been researched. Ali's been researched so many different ways in so many movies and documentaries, but nobody's thought to write about Bundini, his sidekick. So that stuck in my mind. Fast forward a couple years, Hamilcar Publications out of Boston. They're a boxing-based publisher. They do true crime and boxing. Um, they had posted a blog on their website about Bundini being a great hype man, or maybe the first, the first hype man, and it received a lot of attention, a lot of traffic on the internet. So they actively started looking for a writer to pen this story. And when they Googled hip hop and boxing, I was the first person that came up. It was a picture of me and Chuck D. Uh, so we had a conference call. Then we met Drew Brown III, Bundini's son, and we all got to know each other. And it took a couple months for us to all get on the same page. But once the wheel set into motion, the story started coming to life, and we started doing the work, and we found that we had a story that hadn't been told yet.
Absolutely. Before we touch on to this book, have you penned any other previous books, any more in a pipeline coming up?
Yeah, I'm an English professor, so writing is part of how we get our promotions. We publish. A lot of my work is actually academic work in scholarly journals. I've worked with Oxford University Press, different presses on academic pieces. In grad school, I was writing about Appalachian culture. So my first book was called The Rhetoric of Appalachian Identity. It had nothing to do with boxing. My second book was called 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym. My father's name was Mike Lowe Snyder, and it was a memoir about what it means to grow up the son of a coal miner by day and a boxing trainer by night. And that book was the one that sort of sent me on this trajectory. It opened the door for Bundini. Even though I'd grown up around boxing my entire life, I hadn't written much about it. So when I wrote about my dad's gym and my experiences in boxing, it's sort of the genie was out of the bottle. I realized, like, hey, how come I'm not writing about boxing? Because I love it so much. And Lowe's Gym really opened the door for Bundini. Bundini's son read the book and he loved it. He loved the style. My dad, his assistant trainer, we nicknamed him Bundini Dean. His name was Jeff Dean. And Drew liked that. That was already in the book. So we got along really well. And I think he knew that because I had written a book about fathers and sons, that I would be kind to his dad and I would treat him with respect. That his dad had sort of a sketchy, controversial past in some ways, and he knew that I would treat him fair, and I tried my best to do that.
Absolutely. You mentioned it took a long time for you to start writing about boxing itself, although you loved it for such a long time.
It's true.
And obviously, it is your profession, your work, your everyday life is writing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel different when you write about boxing? Do you feel a certain almost passion or different drive when you're writing about boxing?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think so. And here's why. I've been researching and studying for these books my entire life. I've read every Ali book that's at all reputable. I've watched all the documentaries. As a kid, I would watch those old DVDs of, Muhammad Ali's fights and the, ESPN Classic and all that stuff. So in some ways, writing and researching about boxing feels like I've already got a head start because I know it so well and I care about it so much. Although it was really different. Writing Bundini, I went back and rewatched every Ali fight that there's footage of, but I watched it for Bundini. I was waiting for the in between the round stuff. I was watching Bundini after the fight was over as they celebrate. So that was really cool, going back and watching those fights with your focus on a particularly different person. Because Ali's so charismatic, it's hard to look away from him. So I rewatched all those fights just thinking about Bundini. So you're right. It's a different passion. It's exciting. Doesn't feel like work, although it is work. So yeah, Bundini was just an amazing journey. And getting to talk to George Foreman and Larry Holmes. I talked to Khalil Ali yesterday. We were talking about the book. I got to meet a lot of really amazing people in this journey. And Angelo Dundee's son and all these people who were there for the journey. It's hard to call it work because it was so exciting.
Definitely. You said that you went back and watched all of Ali's fights just for seeing Bundini in his role there at each fight.
That's right.
What was that like? What did you identify that you may not have seen before?
Well, you know what? I don't know how I forgot this, but I wasn't aware as to how much he was part of the broadcast and the show. I was watching one Ali fight, and they had a little box at the bottom of the screen, and it was Bundini. They were showing Bundini watch the fight because he would throw punches and duck and get so excited. And I'd forgotten that they did that. There's several Ali fights where the broadcast, they kept Bundini at the bottom of the screen so that you could watch the fight and watch Bundini. And I'll never forget Howard Cosell said during one of the fights, "Ladies and gentlemen, we do not have Bundini mic'd up. He is that loud." And, this fight was at the, I think it was in Los Angeles, in Inglewood, California, at the Spectrum. And he was so loud that they had to tell the audience on TV that Bundini didn't have a microphone on. He was just screaming that loud. And, going back and watching those fights, maybe if you're watching just for Ali, you don't really pay much attention to that. But as I went through and realized that almost every broadcast, there was some comment about it, it made me realize the type of presence he had ringside during those fights. It was pretty fun to watch those tapes with his son, and we would go, his son was at every fight pretty much. And he would tell me stories and we would watch the fights. It was fun. It was a cool journey.
I can imagine. Briefly, nicely to my next question. You mentioned his son there, Drew Brown III. He does feature very heavily in the book. It's fair to say it's probably his account, mainly of Bundini's father, in a large parts of the book. Mm-hmm. What was it like to relive Bundini's life through his son?
Yeah. Look, there are two ways to look at this. Some people could say, oh my goodness, you have so many stories that come from his son. His son is obviously biased. He loves his father. He idolizes his father. He romanticizes it. Well, of course he does. We all do that to our fathers if we have positive relationships with them. These stories have never been told. These stories have never been printed. I knew early on that I had so much, this wealth of knowledge that came from his son, that I would be depriving boxing history by not sharing these stories. And they were often validated by Khalil Ali or validated by, other people who were members of the Deer Lake entourage in Pennsylvania where Ali trained, Tim Witherspoon or Larry Holmes or whoever, Gene Kilroy, who managed the training camps. But I knew early on that, he had so many amazing stories about his father as a man, a husband, a dad, a family member, a friend. I got to see Bundini as a man. I got to read his personal writings, his poetry. He tried to write a book on philosophy. I got to read what was left of it. I got to really know him as a person. And because Bundini is so charismatic, it's easy to think of him, like Ali, as this larger than life figure who couldn't possibly be real, right? So I knew early on that I wanted to tell it through his son's eyes. And I wanted to bring the reader along with me as I interacted with his son and experienced these wild conversations with Foreman and Marvis Frazier, all these guys. So, there are two ways to look at it. One, yeah, it's through the eyes of his son, or a lot of the book is. Two, no one has ever really looked into his family life. His son was a first-generation college student, a motivational speaker. His son tried out for the Harlem Globetrotters. He was a college basketball star. It's kind of neat to see how similar his son is to his dad, to see their flaws, to see their virtues. I couldn't think of any other way to tell it. I just thought that has to be the way we do it because no one has heard these stories before.
Definitely. You mentioned there could be some bias from him because his father, he could romanticize the stories. Was it ever a worry for you going into starting this project that he may be too biased almost?
No, not at all. And here's why. There were plenty of Ali books that I picked up, and they were just outright untruths about Bundini. One book I read said Bundini was born in Harlem. He was born in Sanford, Florida, and he didn't go to Harlem till he was like 26. Even the books that pretend to be capital T truth aren't. That's the fact. Anyone who's read biographies know that, that is part of the genre. That's how it works. So I went into this saying, look, I'm going to be honest with my readers about who I'm getting some of these stories from. And no one was closer to Bundini than his son. He admired his son so much. I mean, his son went on to become a Navy jet pilot on top of all the other stuff that I just mentioned. He's a pretty extraordinary guy as well, and a really reliable source in a lot of ways. He did not shy away from his dad's demons. He wasn't always the best dad. He wasn't always the best husband to Drew's mother. He was an alcoholic. He liked to smoke marijuana. He was a guy who liked to be out at the clubs and party and socialize. He had a problem with women. All that stuff is in the book. We didn't hide or shy away from it. And, one of the stories that we tell is not an easy one. When Drew went off to college, there were some bills and fees that his family couldn't pay. This is Bundini's son. And Bundini went to Ali and said, "Can you help pay for my son's freshman year?" And Ali said, "Sure." He gave the money to Bundini, and Bundini blew it. So when it came time to pay the bills, they had to go back to Ali, and Ali paid for Bundini's son's college year twice because his dad blew the money. But that's not a glamorous story to tell. That's not a positive story. And that came from his son, who wanted me to tell that story to show folks the kind of dad he had. He could be the most loving, perfect father, but he could make a lot of mistakes as well. So I feel pretty comfortable that we're giving people the full panoramic, uh, all the things that made him brilliant and all the things that made him flawed as well.
Definitely. You mentioned there in biographies, there's, untruths about Bundini throughout. Also in this book, you mentioned about the film as well with Will Smith, Ali,
That's right.
untruths in that. But also,
Mhm.
how obviously it's important, but how important was it for you to correct those wrongs and make it clear that they are wrong?
Well, I went into this project having been a big fan of that movie. I think Jamie Foxx is brilliant. Will Smith is brilliant as well. But the more I learned, it's very easy to disprove some of the stuff uh, that's in there. The timeline is way off. A lot of it's just not factually true. And I think anytime you watch a movie that's based on a true story, you know that Hollywood's going to play around with the story a little bit to dramatize it, right? I did feel an obligation to sort of set the record straight because a lot of my students, a lot of people of this younger generation only know Bundini from that movie. And if you were to just watch that movie, you would think he was sort of a clown, a court jester. They portray him as a heroin addict, which was not the case. Yeah, he liked to drink, he liked to party, but he wasn't a heroin addict, and he didn't sell Muhammad Ali's belt for heroin money, as suggested in the movie. So I did kind of feel obligated to sort of set the record straight in that particular issue. Some of the other stuff, that's been out there about Bundini, it's hard to prove or disprove because, like Mike Tyson, the guy behind you, it's very easy to make up a story about him and it's believable because what isn't believable about Mike Tyson? Well, Bundini's one of those figures as well. So, I didn't go into the book looking to rewrite history, but I did want to point out the inconsistencies in the way he's been written about in some of these Ali books and in that film in particular.
With those untruths elsewhere, what effect did they have on his son, Drew Brown III? Did you speak about
Oh,
that? Did that
we
affect him?
did. That movie was very traumatic for the Brown family. I mean, they were like the rest of us, very excited to see the very first, big, Ali movie. I know Ali played in a movie about himself in the 70s. Bundini played himself in that movie as well. But this was the first real Hollywood movie about Ali. And they went to the theater very excited to see it. And, Drew got up and left the theater when he saw the heroin scene. It hurt him very bad. And it was embarrassing to him. He even said to me, if they would have had my dad just drunk or something, I could have understood it. It wouldn't have been correct in that context, but I would have understood what they were up to. They just took it really far. Um, and it was hurtful to the Brown family. And they weren't consulted on that project. And a lot of people who were close to Ali and close to the story were not consulted either. I got to talk to those people. And they felt very sad about how Bundini was portrayed. Larry Holmes, in particular, said to me he felt really bad for the Brown family because that wasn't the man he knew. And he was Ali's sparring partner for 5 years. So for 5 years, he worked with Bundini day in and day out. Never saw him strung out on drugs or anything like that.
Obviously, as well, it does allude to it in the book, Bundini. It wasn't just Muhammad Ali. He did start out with Sugar Ray Robinson, uh,
Yeah,
another fairly well-known name in boxing. Uh,
pretty well known.
Absolutely. When you were doing your research, was there any differences between Bundini with Robinson and Ali?
Absolutely. You got to think he meets Sugar Ray first, obviously, right? And he works with Sugar Ray for 7 consecutive years. But it really is his relationship with a former welterweight champion named Johnny Honeyboy Bratton. You got to be a boxing scholar to know who Bratton is. He fought Kid Gavilan, a couple other big names, but he was sort of a guy who had the belt, did not necessarily, an illustrious career. He was sort of a promising guy to Chicago who had been a good fighter. But he and Bundini meet in Harlem at Sugar Ray Robinson's Golden Gloves barbershop and become friends. So he works with Bratton for a couple fights, handful of fights. just as sort of there in the gym to motivate him, help him out. No official title. He doesn't get to go up in the ring and be a corner man, but they're friends. They work out in the gym together. And it's that relationship that leads to Bundini meeting Sugar Ray Robinson. He meets Sugar Ray at a steakhouse, which is located right beside Sugar Ray's, some of the real estate he owned in Harlem. And Sugar Ray was intrigued by him from the start. And he took him on as sort of an errand guy, an odd job guy. He would just make errands for him. He would even babysit Sugar Ray's kids. So in the first couple years, he just gets to run with Sugar Ray. Sugar Ray's paying him a little bit of money to help him with this and that. They become close friends, and by the end of their relationship, he's at Greenwood Lake, New York, training with Sugar Ray, actually doing the kind of thing he does with Ali later, shadowing him on the bag, speed bag, jumping rope, sparring, that kind of thing. So really, he had like a 7-year apprenticeship with the great Sugar Ray Robinson, learning what it means to be a great champion. And then, at the end of Sugar Ray's career, at the beginning of Ali's trajectory, Sugar Ray kind of passes the baton to the young Cassius Clay, and he says, I found this guy who can really help you focus in training. He's a big part of keeping me focused and motivated, and he's the only guy I've ever met who can out-talk you. He says that to the young Cassius Clay. And Ali and Bundini, of course, become instant friends. They're so much alike. The poetry, the bravado, the slang, they're so much alike. And originally the deal was Bundini would come to training camp and just do the same thing he was doing for Sugar Ray. But Ali liked him so much, he replaced his brother Rahman with Bundini in the corner for that first Liston fight. So they hit it off immediately. And of course, during that first training camp in Miami, that's when Bundini coins the phrase "float like a butterfly, sting like a bee." And they introduce that to the world, and the cameras come to training camp. And Bundini becomes famous in the boxing world really sort of late in the game. He had been in the game for 7 or 8 years.
I was going to say that phrase there. Without that phrase, do you feel that Bundini may not be known today?
That's a great question. I interviewed Thomas Hauser, who was one of Ali's biographers, and he said, if nothing else, Bundini deserves a lot of credit for coining the way that famous poetic line that sort of shapes how we think of Ali, right? But I think he would, if he were a part of that entourage, he still would have been famous because he was there holding Ali back, and he was the first one in the ring, and he was the loudest voice in the corner. Angelo Dundee was a boxing genius, but he really wasn't as gregarious as Bundini. He would have been famous for some other rhyme probably, and he made up a lot of Ali's rhymes. He was sort of Ali's ghostwriter in some ways. So yeah, we would have loved him. That line is the one that sort of we always will remember, but I think the spotlight just went to him. You got to remember, Bundini was a movie star there for a while. He was in 6 Hollywood movies, the Shaft movies and all this other stuff. I think he was just destined to be famous. He was a one of a kind of guy.
And very finally, before I wrap it up, I just want to mention about, go a little bit deeper here into the book. Sure. The timing of the publication as well. Obviously, it came out on the 25th of August this year. Mm-hmm. And it's around about the sort of time where at the moment there's a lot of Black Lives Matter, very political movements. And then the book was Bundini, a black man in racist times, really. And he married a Jewish woman.
He did.
So, it almost sort of came in fitting at the timing of the book. But again, on that side of it, the more serious side of the thing outside of the ropes, how much of an influence or importance was that for you to have in the book?
Well, it was interesting to me that when I had to do some research on where Bundini grew up, it was Sanford, Florida. And I have to tell you, it was at a time where the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was sort of a very dominating presence in Seminole County, Florida. There were cross burnings. There were families chased out of town. Even Jackie Robinson, when he was a minor league baseball player, was ran out of town in Sanford. Very, very tough place to grow up and be a black man, where basically the only work was that tough work in the field, doing cutting celery and the citrus groves. So he grew up in circumstances where, colored only water fountains, that kind of thing. Certain parts of town he couldn't go into as a young boy. And then he joins the Navy at 13 years old, pretending to be 18. And in the Navy, he's essentially a steward. He just shines shoes, cooks in the kitchen, serves the officers. So, racism was a huge part of his life growing up. He grew up in an extremely racist time in a location where things were really hard for Black people. Uh, the sort of interesting thing is he ends up in Harlem at this moment where the Harlem Renaissance is in full swing, and there are Black proprietors, Black-owned sections of the city. Sugar Ray Robinson, for example, he owned a dry cleaning business, a lingerie store, a nightclub, a restaurant, a barbershop, as I mentioned. So Harlem was this Black-owned, Black-occupied part of New York City. He was a part of that scene. So he was almost in a whole nother world. What does he do? He marries a white Jewish woman from Brighton Beach, New York, who her family were Orthodox Jews. So this was an extremely taboo relationship. They have a son, who I mentioned, who's bicultural, biracial, and he raises his son to believe there is no such thing as race. There's only one race, and it's the human race. And Bundini was the kind of guy, it would be a white-only restaurant. He would walk right through the door and order food, and sometimes get away with it. Sometimes they would kick him out. But he was someone who grew up in the time of integration. He grew up in a time where, you know, there were some serious battles to fight for Black people. Of course, he meets Muhammad Ali, the most famous Muslim athlete of all time, maybe, well, probably. And Ali has this very different stance on where we need to go. He's sort of led by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. They had a very different view than Bundini, and it got him in some trouble with the Nation of Islam. But I do feel this book is sort of timely because the topic of racism and the issue of racism, particularly here in the United States, is one that's on the tip of our tongue. We are in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, Sanford was where Trayvon Martin was murdered, and that sort of sets off the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, that's where Bundini was from. That happened in his hometown. So there's no way around it. The issue of race and times of racial strife are sort of the temperature of the book, and it is fitting to what's happening in the world right now. And watching Bundini and Ali work through some of these really tough issues and come out of it better people is inspirational in a lot of ways. Seeing them, you know, go through tough times gives us hope for going through these tough times we're in right now.
Absolutely does. I agree. Todd, I won't keep you no longer. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us on Pro Boxing Fans. I've really enjoyed speaking to you today and enjoyed the book as well. I do recommend everyone goes out and buys it. I think over in the UK it's available on Amazon's probably the best bet to get it. In the UK and probably US as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was my pleasure, and I enjoyed the conversation.